have a lot for podcasts, and you hear a lot online about boundaries. But let's start from the very beginning. You tell me, what is your definition of boundaries and how can we set them?
I love that you asked that question because one of the things that I see a lot is people setting what they call boundaries and not realizing that they are actually building what I consider to be barriers. A lot of people think of a boundary as I'm going to set this rule or expectation to control your behavior or somebody else's behavior. But that's not really what a boundary is. And so I think it's important to kind of start with that non-example to clarify that setting a boundary to try to get somebody else to change their behavior is really not what a boundary is. A boundary is a choice that I am going to make about how I am going to react, I am going to behave, I am going to respond if you do a certain thing. So I'll give you kind of a concrete example. Let's say that I'm in a relationship with somebody and they are always late. Some people might say, well, I just set the boundary with them that was, if you continue to be late, I'm not going to do XYZ. And they do it with the intention of, I'm trying to manipulate you to be on time. Almost kind of like, if not, you're going to get punished. Like it's a child and we're trying to, teach them behavior versus, having a conversation of, I really don't appreciate it when you're late. It makes me feel a certain way. I feel disrespected. I just want to let you know for future reference, if you choose to continue to be late, I will no longer wait for you and I will go about my business. That's a choice for me. It's if this person continues the behavior, what am I going to do? It's not what am I going to do to change the other person. And I think that's something that's fundamentally important to understand in any relationship we have. As much as we may think that we can actually not control anybody else's choices but our own. So that's really what a boundary is about, is what are my choices and my decisions in the face of this thing, not how am I going to try to manipulate or change somebody else's behavior or choice.
Then why do you think so many people confuse boundaries, whereas it's like, I'm setting this boundary to control the behavior of Becky versus what you just explained?
Because I think sometimes people, when we set boundaries, they do change the way that they engage with us. Because at the end of the day, if I really like you and I really want to spend time with you, but I do this thing that drives you crazy, and you set a boundary for yourself that you're not going to be around when I exhibit that behavior. I'll give another example. Let's say I'm somebody who drinks a lot, which I am not, but if I was, and let's say I had a friend who said, Becky, I really don't like to be around you when you drink so much. And so anytime you drink excessively, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. Well, they're not telling me I have to stop drinking so much. They're not telling me they're not going to spend time with me anymore. They're simply communicating what they are going to do in that situation. And sometimes we can have a boundary and not communicate it. So either way, either they tell me or I notice and I say, hey, I noticed that you haven't been coming around. What's going on with that? And they say, well, I really don't like to be around you when you drink so much. So I just choose to not be in those situations. Well, if I really care about that person, it might be a moment of reflection for me. It might be an aha moment of, oh, I never really realized that that person doesn't like the way I act when I drink, or they aren't comfortable around somebody who drinks so much. You know what? I'm going to make a concerted effort to spend more time with that person in other settings. So it could be that somebody's boundary makes me reflect on my behavior and change it. And so I think when we've had those experiences where we've been able to communicate a boundary and communicate our feelings, and we've seen the positive outcome of that, we think, oh, that it, set a boundary, get the change you want. But the reality is sometimes I might set a boundary and somebody else might say this boundary is ridiculous. So I'll give an example of that. If I have a boundary of, I don't like when people talk about weight or body image, it makes me uncomfortable. I could go out with friends that talk about it all the time. And I could say, I'm really uncomfortable when you talk about this thing. And yet, every time I see them, they might continue to bring it up continuously. Or I might have family members that continuously talk about politics, even though I ask them at every holiday to please stop. So we have to kind of go into it realizing that sometimes people respect our boundaries and shift the way they behave, but oftentimes they don't. And sometimes they still do those same behaviors that may drive us crazy. And that doesn't mean the boundary isn't working because the boundary is about us. It's not about changing them.
I like that explanation because if I take that explanation and apply it to my life, I always look at boundaries as something that lets others know what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept. And then everyone has a choice. Either they're going to continue to say that, okay, you don't like drinking. Well, I'm going to get drunk around you every single time I'm around you just to piss you off, right? Because they're stepping over, they're encroaching on your boundary. And then the other aspect is that some people, because let's say of their earlier trauma, they have set so many boundaries. Now it's like their prison where no one can get in, nothing gets out. They're not growing. It's like their bubble where you're just walking around. You're like, oh my God, if I breathe too heavily, is it going to remind them of something that they've gone through and they're going to get triggered? Do you find some people have so many boundaries in place that the way that they operate in their relationships are stressful for not only themselves, but the other person as well?
Where that barriers piece comes in. So I would say people in those situations don't have too many boundaries. What they've done is they put up too many barriers because they have created a situation where, to me, boundaries are about communication and openness about my preferences, which are linked to my values. Like what matters to me, what is important to me in relationship with others. Whereas a barrier, I feel like often touches on what you're talking about, where maybe I've had some bad experiences and instead of saying, well, this is something that, I really need XYZ in terms of communication, it might be something where it's like, if this person doesn't text me good morning every morning, they're not the one for me, right? Well, to me, I don't know that that's something that really is a healthy expectation, is an expectation, it's one thing if it's, this person is in a dangerous place or I can understand in certain circumstances, but when we set those really hard lines around things that aren't really connected to values, but to your point might be connected to past bad experiences or traumas, that to me is often when you see those barriers that then become self-fulfilling prophecies, because if I have so many expectations of everyone around me, it can be really exhausting.
So would that mean then a barrier versus a boundary could be that a boundary is I want to come in contact with someone that's going to treat me well. And therefore, me as a person, since I created that boundary, I go out and look for it versus someone saying that I want a man that makes $100,000 and that's it. Like, would that be like, even though it's exaggerated, but would that be a kind of an example versus a boundary versus a barrier?
Yeah, it absolutely could be. Another example of that might be, if you are meeting somebody, maybe it's like a new situation. And again, you have different levels of communication. That I won't talk about, different, personality types in relationships because that's not my area of expertise. But I feel like you hear these terms all the time with, secure and avoidant and different attachment styles. And so let's say you have people that have very different attachment styles. To me, it's saying to somebody, well, if you don't learn to communicate the way that I need you to communicate, because, I'm avoidant, so I need X number of days between texts, or it's just not going to work for me. To me, that feels like a barrier. That feels like you're creating a wall between us versus a boundary would be something like, hey, it's really important to me that we communicate, and I want to find a way for us to move forward, even though we have very different dating styles. I will tell you, one boundary I have is if I feel disrespected, I'm going to communicate that to you. So be prepared for that. So I think in some ways, to me, there can be kind of some overlap and some interlacing between the two. I think sometimes the intention is very important. Because a boundary to me is an opening up. It's an expanding of a relationship. It's me communicating to you what is important, what do I value, how I want to show up for others, for myself in relationship. Whereas a barrier is much more about restricting who you are and how you get to show up in a relationship.
What do you think then is some of the obstacles that people face when it comes to having healthy boundaries and enforcing these healthy boundaries?
So I like to think of boundary setting in two different ways. Kind of, it has two parts. And the first part is the setting of the boundary. And I think that once you understand how to set a boundary and how to figure out what boundaries to set, the setting of the boundary is actually the relatively easy part. The part that I think is exponentially more difficult for most people is the maintaining of the boundary. Because what we fail to think about, and again, this goes back to that idea of what a boundary is. What we fail to think about is I can set any boundary I want for myself, and you can choose to respond to it in any way you want, right? I have full autonomy to choose my boundaries. You have full autonomy to accept them or to think they're absolutely ridiculous and scoff at them or step on them constantly. In most cases, people don't take it to that extreme. But what happens often is that people don't realize that pushback is a natural part of the boundary process, especially if you've never set boundaries with people before. And so often what happens is when people start to push back, we immediately backpedal. So let's say you are somebody who is in a community of people and you are always the go-to for, oh, we're having community events. So Becky's always going to help out. Becky's going to volunteer her time. Becky's going to help make the food. She's going to do the things and she's going to coordinate. And everybody's just used to that. And then suddenly Becky realizes, oh my gosh, I have so many things on my plate. I've started a new job. I'm taking a class. I have a kid, whatever it is. Um, and I decide that I have to put some boundaries around my time. And I have to start saying no to a lot of things that I haven't said no to before. So I can set that boundary and say, well, if it's not, XYZ things that are my top priorities and my top values, it's just going to have to be a gracious no. And if I'm not prepared for the fact that when I say, oh, sorry, I can't do that this year, but I've done it every year for the past 10 years, and I'm usually the person who does most of the work, people are probably naturally going to try to get me to do that thing. It's not that they're trying to be disrespectful. And yes, in some cases, people can be outright disrespectful. They just don't respect your boundary. But I think a lot of times what ends up happening is we set a boundary, people are not used to it, and our brains as humans don't like change, or they think about the impact on them, and so they kind of try to navigate with us. They try to negotiate. And so it might be, oh, come on, we really need your help. And oh, we actually have fewer people that are helping this year. Like, I don't know what we would do without you. They may have the best of intentions. They're just thinking, oh, we love Becky. She's so helpful. She's a great part of the team. And they're not thinking about, I might be receiving that as, oh my gosh, I'm trying to set this boundary and they're not respecting it. And what a lot of people do is they have this little voice in their brain that's, when you get that pushback, says, I shouldn't be doing this, or this boundary is not okay, or saying no in this situation is going to hurt my relationship. And so what most people do, especially when they're new to setting and maintaining boundaries, is they then backpedal. You know what? Okay, I'll help, but I can't do as much as I did last time. Maybe I'll just do this piece. And so I think just having the awareness that boundary setting is a process, and one of the things that you need to anticipate is some level of pushback, even with people who love you dearly. And I would say sometimes those are the people who push back the most, because if they are used to you being a people pleaser, if they're used to you saying yes, if they're used to you showing up, and suddenly you seem to be changing, it's very uncomfortable for people when we change and when we start setting boundaries we've never had before. And so understanding that that is a normal part of the process, and also understanding that setting boundaries doesn't damage our relationships, are two really pivotal parts of the process.
In that example you gave, I really like that one because it's applicable to a few people that I know that they are in the process of setting boundaries because they began to realize how damaging some of the people around them were. But because it impacted them alone, they're like, okay, you know what? It's not that bad. But then over time, it began to accumulate, right? It's like the straw that broke the camel's back, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It was pointed out to them because as time went on, they began to become frustrated and they didn't know the origins of this behavior towards them. And then when they got into a relationship and they started dating, the other person would see that behavior. And then once they would go home, they would ask them like, hey, why does so and so say those things? Why does so and so treat you that way? And now the person who was, for lack of a better word, tolerating it or at least enduring it, now they have to explain something that kind of doesn't really need an explanation because they feel silly saying that, well, yeah, you know what? That's just the way people are, or that's just the way she is. That's the way he is. It's interesting, at least for me, when I heard that story, and then it was shared that there's some people out there, and I'll get your comment on this, well, Becky, who try to justify the violation of their boundary by others, right? Like you mentioned backpedaling. Not only do they run away from it, they try to make the poor behavior okay for reasons that maybe they don't know or reasons that they don't want to necessarily share because maybe they feel that it won't make sense. Maybe they feel that they'll be judged. Why do you think then people who set these boundaries and who either backpedal or tolerate the violation of these boundaries allow it to go on until someone points it out? And now they're in a situation where, do I defend this or do I be honest with myself and say, okay, this is why it's happening?
So I think there are two ways to look at this. And the first one is from the lens of how we're socialized. I think many of us are socialized that part of our job on this planet is to be a good person. And so we have this idea of, if I am not kind to people, if I say no to people, if I am not agreeable, then I'm not a good person. And I find that this can be especially true for women because of the way that they're socialized to be caretakers. Oh, you're going to be a mother, you're going to take care of children, you're going to take care of the household. And certainly some of that has changed as, time goes on and women are working outside the home. But many of us, myself included, were, raised by a generation where there were certain expectations placed on women that weren't placed on men. And so sometimes, even if those things weren't told to you, you observe them. I remember a time many years ago where I was dating somebody, and I guess there were things that I would do. One example, I remember we were sitting down to eat dinner, and he started to get up, and I said, "What do you need?" And he's like, "Oh, I left my drink in the kitchen." And I got up to get his drink for him. And I didn't think anything of that. And then one time we were at my parents' house, and afterwards he commented and he said, "I get now why you do some of the things that you do. It's because you've seen your mom do them for your dad for your whole life." And to me, nobody ever said to me, like, you have to serve a man, you have to, but I watched my mom cook the meals and bring the food to my father and refill his drink and kind of cater to all of his needs all of the time. And so I internalized a lot of that. And so I think those of us who have internalized behaviors related to, we need to be caretakers, or we need to have, a gentle personality, or we have to be accepting. I am all about being accepting of different people and different viewpoints and different opinions and different perspectives. And I believe that we are well within our right to give a hard no when those opinions and those viewpoints press up against our beliefs and our values. There are some people who, and I talk about this a lot, especially in the recent political landscape, there are a lot of people who um, agree to disagree is something that they live by. And like, we're just going to keep the peace. Um, I don't go looking to not keep the peace, but I also feel like sometimes keeping the peace is harmful on a larger scale and also in terms of relationships. So I think that, the mindset of being an agreeable person makes me a better person. It's important. It's an expectation, is often how people get stuck in those situations where even if they're with somebody who constantly frustrates them, they feel like they kind of have to just be stuck there. The other way that I think this often happens, and there's an analogy, I think it's a frog, where it talks about boiling a frog. And it's like, if you toss a frog into a pot of boiling water, the frog's going to jump right out. But if you put a frog in regular water and then you slowly turn up the heat, the frog is boiling before it realizes what's happening. And so I think, what you were speaking about is, if you've known somebody a long time and then somebody new comes in and they see the nuances that you don't see. Well, sometimes in the beginning, we have that friend and they do that thing or they say that thing to us. And it's like, oh, it's kind of annoying, but that's just how Becky is. And that's just, and I just, roll my eyes and laugh it off. And I agree to disagree and I keep the peace. And then over time, I just get acclimated to it. Right. And so eventually I'm sitting in boiling water, but I'm just still saying, this is Becky doing Becky. And then somebody comes in and is like, Becky's objectively a terrible person. And then it's suddenly I see it through a new lens of, oh, you're right. Maybe that person isn't a good person, or maybe they're just somebody who doesn't align with the kind of people I want to have in my life. Because I think that's another thing. I think sometimes we think in order to not have relationships with people or to create boundaries around our time with others, it has to be that there's something wrong with them. And I would argue that you could be wonderful and I could be wonderful, but our